before we jump into the new content and our objectives for today, at the end of the last session, we were a little bit rushed on those last few slides, and there was a little bit of information that we didn't get to go through. So before we jump to our objectives for today, we're going to look back at those last few slides. But here's our job for today. We're going to share a strategy or resource that we use from the first chapter. We are going to define scaffolding and identify appropriate types of scaffolds for English learners. We will examine ways to differentiate scaffolds at each proficiency level. And then, like I said, we're going to have some time for you to actually plan some scaffolds to use with your English learners. All right, let's look back. At the end of chapter 1, they discussed 4 guidelines for culturally responsive instruction. So those are listed there. And then I wanted to point this out again. If you would like to look back in chapter 1 and are looking for those markers for those 4 guidelines as you look at reflect on your own teaching or when you go into other classrooms, this is the pages that you can look for to check out each of those guidelines. All right, and again, we were talking about multicultural resources when we kind of ran out of time at the end of the first session. So the first chapter talked about the importance of using multicultural books and resources. And page 57 and 58, there are a list of suggested materials and resources. One of them I linked here, a website called Coloring Colorado, which is a fabulous website if you have not used it. There is wonderful information for English learner teachers, for families, for classroom teachers. So it's just a wealth of information. But on this slide, I've linked their list of diverse books to use. It has it broken down by grade level. You can even search by heritage. So that is a really good resource. When we have some time to plan or share later, you could spend hours looking at that resource, but that would be a good place to go. And then we're going to watch this 2-minute video of Dr. Bishop explaining why we need diverse books. Right? I love the way she described how, of course, it's nice for our English learners to see themselves in books, but really all students benefit from using diverse books and books that show different heritage and backgrounds. So I just have a few slides that are just some books that I have used and that I like to use with my students. Again, this is one book. If you're at the elementary or middle school level, I highly recommend this book. It's a great book to get to know each other at the beginning of the year. The main character in the story is looking for her little brother, and it's around dinner time. And so she goes to 6 or 7 of her neighbors' houses and sees what they're cooking for dinner. And they represent 6 or 7 different countries, and they're all cooking something different, but it all has rice. And so, of course, at the end, she finds her brother, but it's just a really neat story. The kids love it. When we read it, we find the countries on the globe. Students get to share a little bit about a favorite dish from their family. So a great one to think about getting to know students and their families. It's called Everybody Cooks Rice, and I'm sure you can find it. All right. And then lastly, I added this. We talked last time about being an advocate and the need for English learners to really have an advocate in the schools. I linked a blog post right here. It says ELL Assets right there at the bottom, where you could, if you want to go back and read it, it talks about ways that we can really be those advocates and ways that we can promote the assets that English learners bring to our schools. So again, at the end, if you have time and you want to come back and look at that, that would be a great place to go. All right, so I think Cayman is now going to put us into some small groups. I'd like for you to think about sharing a strategy, a resource, or something that you use to get to know your students since we met last time about a month ago. And then if it was impactful, how was it impactful? If you haven't had a chance to try anything yet, you can look through the resources that were presented and think about what plan might you have to share a diverse book or how you might get to know your English learners. So,
all right, I'm going to open those rooms now.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, thanks so much. I know our group, we all had time to share a little bit, and then we ended up talking a little bit about Coloring Colorado. So that link is also in the chat if when you have time later to look at Coloring Colorado. So thank you for sharing. I hope that it was a useful time for you. We are actually going to move into our new content now for today's session. So if you want to go ahead and grab your book, we're going to be looking at chapter 3, Scaffolding Instruction for English Learners. And we will use some of the pages in that book. All right, if you look up on the screen, I don't know if this is what you think about when you hear the word scaffolding. These pictures, what you might use to build a house, paint a wall, clean some windows, right? Well, we're going to look at scaffolding for English learners and how we scaffold instruction. We are going to watch a short video first about scaffolding. There we go. All right, I love how the video used visuals and a lot of moving graphics as a way to communicate information and ideas. And we're going to look at some more examples and show how that is really scaffolding, right? That using those visuals and different things is really an example of that. Our text on page 60 in our book, chapter 3, said that scaffolding is a temporary support a teacher provides to a student that enables the student to perform the task he or she would not be able to perform alone. Our book also, right underneath that, quotes Pauline Gibbons. She wrote a whole book on scaffolding. There's a picture of it. It's called Scaffolding Language and Scaffolding Learning. On that previous slide, I linked a page from that book that kind of is a page-long definition of scaffolding. I'm going to read just a little part of that right here. It says, scaffolding is not simply another word for help. It's a special kind of help that assists learners to move towards new skills, concepts, or levels of understanding. Scaffolding is thus the temporary assistance by which a teacher helps a learner know how to do something so that the learner will later be able to complete a similar task alone. It is future-oriented. So what the child can do with support today, he or she can do alone tomorrow. Also, our text said that scaffolding is not simply another word for help, and that the goal, like Gibbons' definition, is that the student will be able to do the task on their own independently, and those scaffolds can be removed. Sorry, was that a question from somebody, or maybe just somebody not on mute? All right, we're going to stop here for a second. There were a lot of information about definitions of scaffolding from the video, from the book, and then from what I just showed. I'd like for you to put maybe a word or a phrase that stands out to you when you think about defining or describing scaffolding. So just in the chat, a word from one of these definitions or a phrase that stands out when you think about what does it mean to scaffold instruction? Yeah. Great. I see a lot of things that word temporary, that definitely stands out to me too. A bridge that helps you get to the next level. Thank you for sharing that. The goal is that they'll eventually be able to do these things more independently. Enables student success. Extra support to ensure success, temporary. Build skills, that gradual release. The video talked about that too, right? Where teachers are a model and then the students do it and then they can do it. We do it together and then they do it on their own. Structuring, that's important too. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Temporary. All right. Great. Thank you so much for sharing those. I'm over here now. All right. If you look on page 61 in our Unlocking book. Oh, wait, sorry. We'll go back to that. Yep. That scaffolding. Oh, there was another comment there. Yeah, structuring. So scaffolding is that special kind of help with the intent to be removed or changed as the student's abilities grow. Our job as teachers is to decide, to find, and to create those appropriate scaffolds for the particular group of students that you're teaching. All right, now we're going to look at some examples of scaffolds. On page 61 in our Unlocking book, figure 3.1 divides scaffolds into 3 main categories. The first one is materials and resources. The second category is instruction, and that third category is student grouping. We're going to look at some examples that are in that materials and resources section. And then again, at the end, you're going to have time to use these resources to plan, hopefully, some scaffolds for some future lessons. All right, so first, this is a picture. This is on the next page, on page 62. This is an example of a Venn diagram. And I like this example because not only is it a visual representation of information, which is a scaffold, a way to make things more understandable for our students, but also it uses visuals. It's got pictures instead of just words. So that's very accessible for students who are even at a very beginning level of English. And I know people use those. All right. The next example is figure 3.3, and that's on page 63. It is a bilingual glossary. So it has the word in English and in Spanish this time. There's an example of how it was used and then a definition. There's not a picture, but there is a box to put a picture and then ask whether or not it is a cognate. I think it's important, and the text points this out too, that whenever you're having students define words, that you use a student-friendly definition. Many times the Webster's Dictionary definition that they find is often more confusing and very wordy. So if we're trying to make things more accessible, using that student-friendly definition and having a visual or a picture when possible is very helpful. All right, there we go. The next example is figure 3.5. That's on page 65 if you're following along in the book. I think this is a scaffold that many teachers use, using sentence starters, sentence frames, or a paragraph frame. This is a more advanced scaffold. But what I like about sentence frames and paragraph frames is that you can make them very simple or you can make them more complex. So a very simple sentence with maybe just one blank, and maybe you even have some pictures to go with it, would be an appropriate scaffold for a beginning English learner student. This example looks like it's more for intermediate or an advanced speaker of English. So those can easily be modified.
Can I ask a question real quick?
Sure.
So kind of what we talked about when we were in our small groups is how you have different levels. You're saying like a beginner,
Right.
a beginner speaker, and then a more advanced, how you're kind of breaking those down in the classroom when you have 12 kids that need different levels. Are we going to talk about some of that? Are you small grouping like to do that, or do you have ideas for that, how that kind of works?
Yes, we're going to look at, in a couple more slides, there's a chart that explains some scaffolds that are appropriate for beginners, for middle and intermediate, advanced students. But it is very challenging when you have a group of students and they're all at different levels. So
that's what I'm saying, they're mixed.
Yeah, being able to have some small group instruction, or really to have materials that are ready for your beginning students, materials that are ready for your intermediate students, and then for those advanced students. So it does take more work, right, to have a variety of materials ready. We'll talk about that. Hopefully you have an English learner teacher that is maybe collaborating with you that can help create and use some of those materials. But that's a great thing to talk about, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit, and maybe in your small group. All right, the next slide has word banks. Again, I think this example is our math words, multiplication and division, but this can easily be adjusted to have those pictures or other visuals when needed. This can also be used in conjunction with other scaffolds, right? So if you're using sentence frames, you might have a word bank for students that need it, or perhaps you have other students that don't. All right, so it's the very next slide. What we're gonna talk about. This is on page. Let me see, what page was that in your book? It is on. I think I lost it. I don't have that one written down. It has some suggestions for scaffolds at the different proficiency levels. So you can look
That's
right
on
there.
page 72.
72. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Page 72. Yep, I got it. Figure 3.9. So beginning students might need, again, more pictures, very simple sentence frames, word walls, word banks, and anything that you can do to reduce that load of language. Sorry, those keep coming through. Intermediate students, again, access to text, sentence stems, word walls. And advanced, if you look on the far right-hand column, the blue box, light blue box, has scaffolds that are appropriate for all levels. So yeah, that's the part that is a little more challenging and the part that just takes more time, right? Choosing the appropriate scaffold for all of the students in your particular setting. All right. Before we have some time to plan, we're actually going to go to page 72, and I'd like for you to read. It says Mrs. Olson's class, scaffolding a unit on immigration. The bottom of page 72, there's a few sentences, and then the top of page 73. Sorry, not sure what that was. I'd like for you to read that short scenario and then underline or highlight the scaffolds that she uses with her students. After about 2 to 3 minutes, if you wouldn't mind to put one of those that you found in the chat. We'll talk about those in just a second. So the bottom of page 72 and the top of page 73. All right, great. Thank you. I've already got lots of things going in the chat. Bilingual glossaries, sentence stems. Anybody have pre-teaching that vocabulary? Text with a video. Video in the native language, video in Spanish. Thank you. All right, awesome. Glossary, okay. Thank you so much. So we're gonna kind of move towards getting into some work time. And before we do that, I'm gonna share a few more resources and some places to look in the book before you have some time to actually pick out, plan some scaffolds for your students. Page 70, if you go back a page, lists 5 steps for beginning to think about how to scaffold a lesson. First, important, we talked about that last time, right? Know your L's. 2, analyze the language demands of the lesson. So what are you going to be asking all of your students to do? What are they going to have to read? What can we do to help those or to modify those resources? What are they going to have to speak? If they're doing any group works, what are they going to have to write? So think about all of the ways that they're going to use language in that lesson, in your lesson, and then select and develop appropriate materials, which again, we've talked about. That's the hard part, right? The part that you need some time to actually work on. Teach the lesson and then adapt scaffold and materials as needed for your different students. All right, this slide has a checklist. It's also on page 74 in your book. Can be a little overwhelming, but we're gonna look through each one of those, and when you have some work time, you can look closely at those. The next few slides have basically the same information that's presented in this chapter on page 74, just chunked. And I like this version better because if you look, it's got some visuals, right? It's got some pictures. It's a little bit easier to understand. First, again, I know the strengths and needs of my multilingual students. I have analyzed the language demands. 3, I've developed a list of key vocabulary. 4, I've determined how I will teach and provide students an opportunity to practice language. 5, how can I activate background knowledge? 6, intentionally grouping students. We're going to spend a lot of time in a future session talking about that too. How can I include opportunities for students to practice? Selected any home language resources that are available. And then 9 and 10, developing those scaffolded materials and determine how I will assess students and if any of that needs to have some extra help or some scaffolds. If you click on this link when you have work time up there at the top where it says sentence STEM resource, it's like a 4-page document. I've taken a picture of part of it, but it has some sentence frames for different academic purposes, some sentences and paragraph frames. There's also a great chart that has some signal words on it. So I can click on that if you want. If you are looking for, yeah, so there's a little bit of some why, some more simple sentence frames. And that's the one I took a picture of. And then I really like this chart with, simple sentence frames. And then there's a chart that has a lot of signal words that are very helpful. This last page talks about how to create word banks. So that could be something important to go back to when you have your work time in just a second. This last slide was taken from the WIDA website, which is our English Language Proficiency Assessment company. And it has some other scaffolds, some sensory supports, graphic supports, interactive supports. And I think that you probably have done a lot of these things. Again, we just need the time to proactively plan and intentionally plan to use some of these supports. The bottom graphic shows supports by subject area. So that might be a helpful place to go back and look when you're thinking about your scaffolds. So we've got a lot right now. You can look through the chapter of the book, chapter 3. I put the link to the slides, and I think Alec also shared the slides again in the chat. So you could click on those as a resource. We talked about that Coloring Colorado. We've talked a lot about how using visuals. If you needed some time just to look at your next lesson and pick some visuals, go to Google and find some images that will help scaffold instruction for your students. I would also encourage you to look at any textbook or curricular resources that you have. If you have adopted them recently, I think you might find that some of this work is already done for you. I know I'm on the committee at our school to select new reading and writing materials, and we've looked at 2 companies. The amount of scaffolding and support for newer resources it's just incredible. Like the resource that we're using now, there's like a blurb at the beginning of each unit or each unit that's a very generic this is how you could help English learners. Well, the new curriculum that we're looking at, they have sentence frames at every proficiency level. They have a beginning, middle, and advanced proficiency level sentence frame. It's specific to each lesson. So if there are any curricular resources that you have that you can look at, all of those things, I really wanted you to have some time to plan scaffolds to use with your students. So we're going to go back to breakout rooms. I think that Cayman is going to put us into breakout rooms. If that way you have somebody that you can kind of bounce ideas off of. If you would rather, you can leave your microphone on mute for a little bit, have some work time on your own. And then if you wanted to share out at the end, I'm hoping that we're going to have we can have about 20 minutes of work time in our groups. So you can have some time to work on your own. If you want to talk through it with somebody in your group, I think that would be great. And then before we come back together, maybe you can share one scaffold that you plan to use. And we'll do that a little bit next time too. So are there any questions before you get into your groups and have some work time?
Can I ask while we're waiting for people?
Sure.
Allison. So I have noticed with like the Arabic within class, the Google Translate, that doesn't seem to do as well. My girl still kind of, my student still kind of struggles with that.
Mhm.
Is there any, like, I haven't dug into all of these, but is there any representation of what might help, like, for those types of things? Is it just Google Translate, or is there another way to do that a little better with the Arabic?
As far as like translation service, like
Yeah.
platforms, I feel like I've used Google Translate a lot. I feel like that's probably the most popular. I know that you
Okay.
can get it on, on Chromebooks, and when you have that microphone feature on, students can, it will translate what the teacher's saying. So I would say
Okay.
Google Translate is a good one, but it could be that she doesn't really understand all of the academic language in Arabic, right? I don't know what level or what the content is, but
Okay.
it could be that maybe her Arabic is fine. Maybe she is not deep in Arabic, and so when it's translating very complex things, she needs help.
Do you mind if I jump in and answer that question?
Sure.
I was just going to say that Arabic is highly dialectal. So there's so many dialects of it. Sometimes they don't have mutual intelligibility. Like you can't have the base or main dialect and then have somebody from a different country may not be able to understand that. The academic language is different. All of it is different. And so Google Translate tends to do standard dialects. So if she has not that standard dialect, then it's going to cause her to not be able to understand or grasp as well. What I might do is try to find out what dialect is spoken in what country she's from. I know that there are some really great word-to-word dictionaries, which isn't the best solution, especially if she's had prior schooling or, she's literate in Arabic, which is a fantastic thing for her to have and keep up. But it might be a better solution. And just keep in mind that Google Translate does do standard dialects only. So like I can speak Spanish, but I learned a Guatemalan dialect. So sometimes Google Translate, I'll go, no, that's not right, because that's Spanish of Spain. And that's true for most languages that Google Translate is translating.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, that's an excellent point. Thank you so much for sharing. Someone just put something else in the chat too to help with Arabic speakers. If you want to check that out.
Yes, thank you.
I hope that your work time was productive and that you were able to plan or to find some resources to use with your students. All right, we're going to end with one of my favorite quotes. It says, "Kids are who they are. They know what they know. They bring what they bring. Our job is not to wish that students knew more or knew differently. Our job is to turn each student's knowledge into a curricular strength rather than an instructional inconvenience. We can do that only if we hold high expectations for all students, convey great respect for the knowledge and culture they bring to the classroom, and offer lots of supports in helping them achieve those expectations." So I love that. It just, it challenges me every time I read it and think about it. This is the hard work that we do. So thank you for the hard work that you do every day to plan and deliver quality instruction to your English learners. Like I said, it is not easy, but it is so worthwhile. We are.
Allison, I want to point out to folks that there's a link to our exit survey, and we will use this exit survey for attendance. So if you can please just take a couple minutes to fill that out. I think Allison's going to let you go a couple minutes early, but use that time to finish the survey if you would, please.
Yep. So there were our objectives for the day. I hope that we can say we checked all of those off. And yep, if you want to go back to I'm going to leave that one up, but if you want to go find the survey in the chat, fill that out, and then actually, I think I'll leave this one up. Our next session is going to be Wednesday, January 17th.